Those buzzing menaces have to go, Mr. Riley. The bylaws are explicit. No livestock. The voice, sharp and grating as a rusty hinge, cut through the peaceful hum of my backyard. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was Karen, the self-appointed queen of our little suburban fiefdom, the president of the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association. I slowly straightened up from my hive inspection, pulling off my leather gloves and setting the smoker down on the small wooden table I use for my beekeeping tools. She stood just on her side of the invisible property line, a formidable figure in a floral muumuu that did little to soften her militant posture. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and next to her, a much younger, visibly terrified man I recognized as a new board member named Tim clutched a clipboard like a shield. The late afternoon sun glinted off her oversized sunglasses, hiding her eyes but not the sneer that was a permanent fixture on her face. I had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and in that time, Karen had managed to turn a quiet community into a place of whispered complaints and petty anxieties, all enforced by her iron-fisted interpretation of the HOA covenants. "Good afternoon, Karen," I said, my voice deliberately calm. I made a point of looking past her to the nervous man. "Tim, isn't it? Welcome to the board." Tim gave a jerky little nod, his Adam's apple bobbing. Karen's sneer tightened. She hated being ignored, even for a second. "Don't you good afternoon me, Jack," she snapped, thrusting a piece of paper in my direction. Tim, on cue, scurried forward and nervously handed it to me across the lawn. It was a formal violation notice printed on thick, important-looking letterhead. My eyes scanned the text. Violation of HOA Bylaw 12.4, Prohibition of Livestock. The fine was listed in bold, angry numbers, $500. Below that, a threat. Failure to remove the offending animals within seven days will result in daily fines of $100, followed by the placement of a lien against the property. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the smug satisfaction of someone who believes they hold all the cards. I looked from the paper to my hives. 4 simple Langstroth boxes, painted a gentle white, nestled among the lavender and salvia my wife Sarah had planted specifically for them. My bees, my tiny, diligent partners in pollination, were being classified as barnyard animals. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, but the threat was very real. This wasn't about a misplaced garden gnome or grass that was a 1/4 inch too high. This was a direct assault on my property, my passion, and though she didn't know it, my profession. "Karen," I said, folding the paper with practiced precision, "bees are not livestock." She let out a short, barking laugh. "They're animals you keep for profit, aren't they? You sell that honey of yours at the farmer's market. That's livestock, Jack. And they're a menace. What if little Madison from next door gets stung? Her parents are very concerned." I knew for a fact that little Madison's parents had been over for a barbecue just last week and were fascinated by the bees, even taking home a small jar of my spring harvest. Karen was manufacturing consent, creating a crisis where none existed. This was her signature move. She was a master of turning whispers into regulations, anxieties into fines. But this time, she had picked the wrong fight with the wrong man over the wrong subject. The paper in my hand felt less like a threat and more like an exhibit, the first piece of evidence in a case I was already building in my head. If you think this is insane, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Have you ever had an HOA nightmare like this? Because this was just the beginning of a battle that would unravel not just Karen's little empire, but the very fabric of our community. I looked back at her, standing there on my lawn, the picture of entitled authority, and I let a small, tight smile touch my lips. She had just handed me a formal notice citing a bylaw, but what she didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that she wasn't just arguing with a hobbyist beekeeper. She was challenging the man who had personally written the county law that made her little notice utterly worthless. And I was going to enjoy teaching her the difference between a private covenant and a public statute, one meticulously documented step at a time. The war had begun, and she had just fired the first wildly inaccurate shot. I tucked the violation notice into my back pocket, a promise of the methodical dismantling to come. The hum of the bees seemed to grow a little louder, a chorus of defiance she was completely deaf to. My journey to this suburban battlefield was a long and winding one. For 20 years, I was a logistics officer in the United States Marine Corps, a career that taught me three fundamental truths. Mission first, never underestimate your enemy, and the side with the better paperwork always wins. My life was a symphony of supply chains, operational planning, and contingency strategies. I moved men and materiel across continents, coordinated complex operations in hostile environments, and learned to find order in chaos. When I retired as a lieutenant colonel, all I wanted was the opposite. I wanted quiet. I wanted a small piece of land where the only logistics I had to worry about were how many bags of mulch to buy and whether the tomatoes were getting enough sun. My wife Sarah and I found that quiet in Crestwood Hills, a sprawling subdivision that was just far enough from the city to feel like the country. We bought a house with a half-acre lot, backing up onto a greenbelt. It was perfect, and for a while, it was. I got into beekeeping, a hobby that spoke to the part of me that appreciated complex, self-sustaining systems. It was a world of intricate social structures, hard work, and sweet rewards. Watching a colony thrive, seeing the bees diligently pollinate every flower in a 3-mile radius, it was a kind of therapy. It was the antithesis of war. It was creation. But even in paradise, there are snakes. Our snake was Karen. When we first moved in, she was just a nosy neighbor, the kind who'd leave passive-aggressive notes about your recycling bin being left out an hour too long. But then she ran for HOA president on a platform of restoring community standards, which was code for making everyone live by my arbitrary rules. She won, largely because no one else wanted the job. Her reign began subtly. First, it was a standardized mailbox and post, a specific shade of beige that everyone had to purchase from a company owned by, we later learned, her cousin. Then came the crusade against unapproved landscape lighting and the infamous holiday decoration edict, which specified the exact dates decorations could be put up and taken down, under penalty of a daily fine. Sarah and I, like most of our neighbors, just rolled our eyes and complied. It was easier than fighting. We were busy with our own lives. I had taken a civilian job with the county, a quiet position in the planning department that utilized my logistical skills. But when the long-serving agricultural commissioner retired, several county supervisors who knew of my background and my growing passion for small-scale agriculture approached me. They wanted someone with organizational skills and a fresh perspective. After a series of interviews and a formal appointment process, I became the new county agricultural commissioner. It was a role I took very seriously. I saw the growing conflict between urban sprawl and the desire for people to have a small connection to their food source. A few chickens, a vegetable garden, a beehive. I saw HOAs like ours using broad, outdated bylaws to crush these small endeavors. So, my first major project was drafting what would become County Ordinance 7.14b, the Urban Agriculture and Apiary Act. I spent 6 months on it, consulting with entomologists from the state university, lawyers, and urban farming advocates. I crafted the language with the precision of a military order. I defined livestock specifically by a list of traditional farm animals: bovine, equine, porcine, ovine, and so on. Then I created a separate, distinct classification for apiaries, defining them as the keeping of Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, in movable frame hives. The ordinance explicitly stated that as long as a beekeeper was registered with the county, followed best management practices, which I also clearly defined, like hive placement setbacks and maintaining a water source, and kept under a certain number of hives based on lot size, their right to keep bees was protected. Crucially, I included a preemption clause. This ordinance shall supersede any and all private covenants, conditions, or restrictions of a homeowners association that seek to prohibit the responsible keeping of apiaries as defined herein. I shepherded it through public hearings, defended it before the Board of Supervisors, and watched with pride as it was passed into law unanimously. It was a good piece of legislation, balanced and fair. It was my contribution to the quiet life I had sought, and I never imagined for a second that the first person to brazenly challenge it would be the tin pot dictator living 3 doors down. Karen, in her blind quest for power, was about to run headfirst into a legal fortress that I, her quiet, beekeeping neighbor, had built brick by brick. The evening after the confrontation, I didn't storm over to Karen's house or fire off an angry email. My training took over. You don't engage in a shouting match when you have superior firepower. You prepare the battlefield. Sarah watched me, a worried line creasing her forehead, as I spread the documents out on our large oak dining table. The table where we shared family meals and helped our son with his homework was now my command center. On one side, I placed the Crestwood Hills HOA, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a thick, ponderous document I had received when we bought the house, and like most people, had barely glanced at. On the other side, I placed a certified gold-sealed copy of County Ordinance 7.14b, the Urban Agriculture and Apiary Act. In the middle, I placed Karen's violation notice. "What are you going to do, Jack?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on my shoulder. "I'm going to do what Karen does," I replied, tapping the HOA document, "but I'm going to do it correctly." I showed her the specific bylaw Karen had cited, 12.4, Prohibition of Livestock. It was a single sentence, poorly written and vague. No animals, livestock, or poultry of any kind shall be raised, bred, or kept on any lot, except that dogs, cats, or other household pets may be kept, provided that they are not kept, bred, or maintained for any commercial purpose. Her argument is that since I sell a few jars of honey, it's a commercial purpose, and since bees are animals, they're prohibited, I explained. It's a weak argument, but it's the only one she has. Then I tapped the county ordinance. "But this is the law of the land, Sarah. This isn't a private rule book. It's a public statute." I flipped to the definition section I had so carefully crafted. Livestock, bovine, equine, porcine, no mention of insects. Then, Section 3, apiaries. An apiary is defined as the keeping of Apis mellifera, a completely separate category. And then the kill shot, I said, my finger landing on the preemption clause. "This ordinance shall supersede any and all private covenants." I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. I wasn't just going to tell them they were wrong. I was going to provide them with an education. I began to draft my official response. It was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. I addressed it to the HOA Board of Directors, care of their management company. I started by acknowledging receipt of their notice. Then I systematically dismantled their position. "Pursuant to the noticer," I wrote, "the alleged violation concerns HOA bylaw 12.4 regarding livestock. Please be advised that under the superseding authority of County Ordinance 7.14b, apiaries are explicitly and legally distinct from livestock." I cited the specific sections and definitions. "Furthermore," I continued, "Ordinance 7.14b, Section 8, contains a preemption clause which invalidates any HOA bylaw that contradicts its provisions regarding the responsible keeping of bees. For your convenience, I have attached a certified copy of the full ordinance." I then detailed my full compliance with every aspect of the ordinance, from my county registration number to the exact distance of my hives from the property line. I finished the letter by respectfully requesting that they immediately rescind the violation notice and the associated fine, and issue a formal confirmation that my apiary is in full compliance with the governing legal framework. I made 2 copies, put the original and the certified ordinance in a large envelope, and the next morning, I drove to the post office and sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested. It was a clean, surgical strike, a clear presentation of superior legal authority. I expected a grudging letter of apology, or, more likely, a sullen silence. What I got instead was a declaration of total war. 10 days later, another envelope arrived. It wasn't an apology. It was a letter from the HOA's lawyer. It curtly stated that their interpretation was that private covenants were not subject to county ordinances, a legal fantasy of the highest order. It also informed me that my failure to comply had resulted in my fine being doubled to $1,000, and that daily fines were now accruing. Karen hadn't just ignored my letter, she had spat on it. She was escalating. And I knew then that this was no longer about a simple misunderstanding. This was about power, and she was willing to burn the whole neighborhood down to keep it. This wasn't about bees anymore. I knew it, and Sarah knew it. This was about a woman so drunk on a thimbleful of power that she was willing to lie, cheat, and bully anyone who didn't bow to her. The lawyer's letter was the turning point. It told me Karen was not operating in good faith. She was insulated by a board of terrified sycophants and a cut-rate lawyer willing to tell her whatever she wanted to hear. A direct, logical assault had failed because the target was irrational. It was time for flanking maneuvers. My military training taught me that intelligence is the key to any successful campaign. You need to know the terrain, the enemy's strength, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. Karen's weakness, I suspected, was the same as any tyrant's. She had enemies she didn't know about, and her arrogance made her sloppy. So I started my reconnaissance mission. I began taking walks around the neighborhood in the evenings, not with headphones in, but with a friendly, open demeanor. I started with Art, a retired mechanic who lived 2 houses down. Art had been in Crestwood Hills for 30 years and had seen it all. I found him in his garage, tinkering with a vintage lawnmower engine. "Hey, Art," I started, leaning against the doorframe. "Got a minute?" He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and nodded. "For you, Jack, sure. Heard you're in the crosshairs of Queen Karen." The name made me smile. "You could say that. She seems to have a thing about my bees." Art let out a gruff laugh. "Son, she has a thing about everything. Last year she tried to fine the Millers because their kid's wheelchair ramp wasn't on the approved color palette. Can you believe that? The ramp he needs to get into his own house." My blood ran cold. This was more than petty. It was cruel. "What happened?" I asked. "Oh, Miller's a lawyer. He threatened to sue her and the entire board into the next century under the Americans with Disabilities Act. She backed down so fast she left skid marks, but she never forgave them for it." This was valuable intel. Karen backed down when faced with a credible legal threat, especially one that carried public shame. Art went on, the stories pouring out of him like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. He told me about the Garcias, a young couple who had planted a small Japanese maple in their front yard as a memorial to their stillborn daughter. Karen had cited them for an unapproved planting and forced them to dig it up, leaving the poor woman in tears. He told me about her constant harassment of single mothers, new families, anyone she perceived as unable or unwilling to fight back. A clear pattern of abuse was emerging. She was a predator who culled the weak from the herd. But then Art lowered his voice. "The thing you really ought to look into, Jack, is the money. Every year our dues go up, but the services get worse. The pool is always cloudy, the playground equipment is rusting. But you see that brand new fancy stonework and all those rose bushes around the front entrance? The ones right by her house?" I nodded. "Well," Art continued, "the guy who owns the landscaping company that did all that work? That's Karen's brother-in-law. Got the no-bid contract. Funny how that works." A jolt went through me. This was it. This was the vulnerability. Petty tyranny was one thing, but financial misconduct? That was a different level of trouble. That was a breach of fiduciary duty. That was a crime. I thanked Art, my mind already racing. The next morning I called David Chen, my old roommate from officer candidate school. He'd left the Corps as a captain in the JAG office and now had a thriving private practice in the city, specializing in real estate and corporate law. "Dave, it's Jack Riley. Colonel Riley," he boomed over the phone. "To what do I owe the honor? Don't tell me you finally decided to sue the government for making you eat MREs for 2 decades. I laughed. "Not today. Today I've got an HOA problem." I spent 20 minutes laying out the entire situation. The bees, the ordinance I wrote, Karen's escalation, her lawyer's ridiculous letter, and what Art had told me about the potential financial malfeasance. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jack," David said finally, his voice no longer booming, but sharp and focused, "this is beautiful. This is a work of art. This woman is a textbook case of a board member run amok." "So what's my next move?" I asked. "We go on the offensive," David said, a predatory glee in his tone. "Under state law, as a homeowner, you have the right to inspect the association's financial records. All of them. Meeting minutes, contracts, invoices, bank statements. We're not going to ask for them. We're going to demand them." I'll draft the letter. You're going to become her worst nightmare, Jack. A highly motivated, detail-oriented logistician with a legal right to see every dirty receipt she's ever signed. The paperwork war was about to begin in earnest. The letter David drafted was a masterpiece of legal lethality. It was polite, formal, and utterly uncompromising. It cited three separate state statutes governing common interest developments, each one affirming my right as a member of the association to inspect, review, and copy all financial documents, contracts, and board meeting minutes from the past 3 fiscal years. It wasn't a request, it was a formal demand for inspection, giving them a legally mandated deadline of 10 business days to make the records available at the association's office. David included a pointed sentence about the penalties for noncompliance, noting that board members could be held personally liable for legal fees incurred in any action to compel discovery. That personal liability clause was the bayonet on the end of the rifle. I sent the letter again via certified mail and waited. The 10 days passed in silence. On the 11th day, I received an email from the HOA management company. It was a transparent attempt to stonewall. They claimed that compiling such a large volume of records would be unduly burdensome and that in order to proceed, I would need to prepay a research and copying fee of $2,500. The number was so absurdly high, it was clearly designed to be a deterrent. They were betting I would give up. They bet wrong. I forwarded the email to David. His reply was almost instantaneous. Idiots, they just fell for the oldest trick in the book. They acknowledge the existence of the records and are now illegally obstructing access. Let's turn the screw. David's second letter was a thing of beauty. It was addressed directly to the individual board members, including the terrified-looking Tim. He eviscerated their claim of a research fee, citing the specific statute that limited copying charges to 10 cents per page and forbade any charge for simple inspection of the records. He characterized their demand for $2,500 as a bad faith attempt to obstruct a member's statutory rights. Then came the hammer. Be advised, where he wrote, that any further delay or obstruction will result in our filing for a court order to compel production. In such an action, we will be seeking not only the records themselves, but full reimbursement of all legal fees and punitive damages against the association and its board members personally for this willful and malicious obstruction. He gave them 48 hours to provide a date and time for my inspection. The threat of being personally sued, of having to pay out of their own pockets for Karen's war, was a bucket of ice water on the rest of the board. The very next day, I got a frantic call from Tim. "Mr. Riley," he stammered, "please, the board has approved your request. The records will be available for your inspection this Friday at the management company's office. No charge, please, can you call off your lawyer?" "There's nothing to call off, Tim," I said calmly. "Just comply with the law. That's all I've ever asked." When Friday came, Sarah and I drove to the management company's soulless office park. A grim-faced manager led us to a small, windowless conference room. In the middle of the table were 5 large cardboard boxes, overflowing with binders, folders, and loose papers. It was a document dump, designed to overwhelm and intimidate. They thought they were burying me in paperwork. They didn't realize that paperwork was my native language. For the next 3 nights, our dining room table disappeared under a mountain of financial records. It was like an archaeological dig into 3 years of Karen's reign. Sarah, who was an accountant before our son was born, was in her element. She set up a spreadsheet while I sorted and cross-referenced. We drank coffee, put on some quiet music, and we dug. It didn't take long to find the rot. The landscaping contract with Karen's brother-in-law was even worse than Art had suspected. It was an evergreen contract with no termination clause and rates that were nearly double the market average. We found invoices for emergency tree removal on a clear, windless day, with the address listed being suspiciously close to Karen's own. We found credit card statements for the HOA's card, filled with charges for expensive dinners at fancy restaurants, listed as board planning meetings, but with no corresponding meeting minutes. There was a charge for over $1,000 at a home decor store, categorized as clubhouse refurbishment, but the clubhouse hadn't been updated in years. The pattern was undeniable. It was a systematic siphoning of community funds for personal benefit and comfort, all hidden in plain sight, buried under the assumption that no one would ever bother to look. As I highlighted another questionable charge, a smug sense of satisfaction washed over me. Karen thought her power came from her title and her book of rules. She was wrong. True power came from information, and I now had all the information I needed to burn her empire to the ground. While the financial investigation was my strategic, long-term objective, Karen was still focused on the tactical fight over the bees. Her ego was so bruised by my defiance that she couldn't let it go. Having failed to intimidate me with her own authority, she decided to bring in what she believed was a higher power. She called county code enforcement. This was the move I had been anticipating, the moment the entire conflict would pivot. It was a warm Tuesday morning when the white county truck pulled up to my curb. A young man in a crisp uniform, his name tag reading Officer Miller, got out holding a tablet. He had the weary look of someone who spends his days dealing with petty neighbor disputes. I saw Karen watching from her window, a ghostly silhouette behind the blinds, no doubt savoring what she thought was my impending humiliation. I walked out to meet him before he even reached my door. "Officer Miller?" I asked, extending a hand. "Jack Riley. I'm guessing you're here about the bees." He looked a little surprised by my calm demeanor. "Yes, sir. We received a complaint about a possible code violation. Something about keeping livestock." "I see," I said, my voice level. "Why don't you come on back? I'll show you the operation." I led him through the side gate into my backyard. The bees were peacefully going about their business, a gentle hum filling the air. Officer Miller looked at the hives, then back at his tablet, a confused expression on his face. "Complaint says you're running a commercial apiary, that it's a danger to the neighborhood." I nodded. The complaint was filed by my HOA president, who seems to be under a few misapprehensions. "First of all, let me show you my county registration." I handed him a laminated card from my wallet. He scanned the barcode with his tablet. My name and address popped up on his screen, along with the status, "Registered apiary, in good standing." His eyebrows shot up. "Okay," he said, "so you're registered, but we still need to check compliance with the ordinance." "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to walk you through it. I'm quite familiar with the regulations." I then reached into my back pocket and pulled out my other wallet, the one I used for work. I flipped it open to reveal my credentials. "Jack Riley," I said, pointing to the official county seal and my title. "County Agricultural Commissioner." Officer Miller's jaw practically hit the grass. He looked from the ID to my face, then back to the ID. Color flooded his cheeks. "Oh, sir, I had no idea." "It's all right, officer," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "You have a job to do. Let's do it." Now, as I'm sure you know, County Ordinance 7.14b, which I authored, requires a 10-foot setback from any property line for a hive opening. I pulled a tape measure from my tool table. As you can see, these hives are 15 feet from the back fence and over 25 feet from the side fences. Compliant. I walked him over to the bird bath. The ordinance requires a consistent water source within 20 feet of the hives to prevent the bees from seeking water in a neighbor's swimming pool. This bird bath is 12 feet away. Compliant. I pointed to the hive entrances. The ordinance requires flyaway barriers if the hives are near a public path. Since my yard backs onto a private greenbelt, no barrier is required. But you can see I've planted these tall sunflowers anyway, just as a best practice, to encourage them to fly up and over. I walked him through every single point of the law, not as a homeowner defending himself, but as the author of the code explaining its intent and application. Miller, to his credit, was professional. He dutifully took notes and photos, his initial nervousness replaced by a look of dawning comprehension. He wasn't just inspecting a property, he was getting a masterclass in the law he was supposed to enforce, from the man who wrote it. "Well, Commissioner," he said when we were done, shaking his head in disbelief, "everything is perfect. Textbook compliance." He tapped a few things on his tablet. "I'm closing this complaint as unfounded, and I'll be adding a note that, given the circumstances, the initial complaint appears to be frivolous and potentially filed for the purpose of harassment." "Thank you, officer. I appreciate your thoroughness," I said. He shook my hand, still looking a bit dazed, and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, I looked over at Karen's house. The silhouette in the window was gone. She had just fired her biggest cannon, and not only had it misfired, but the shot had been logged, documented, and officially declared an act of harassment by the very authority she had tried to weaponize. The trap had been sprung. I now had an official, government-stamped document proving I was right and she was wrong, and I knew exactly when and where I was going to use it. The unfounded report from code enforcement sent Karen into a rage. Her attempt to use the county as her personal bludgeon had failed spectacularly, and now she looked foolish. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. Her ego wouldn't allow for anything less. A few days later, a garish neon pink flyer appeared on every doorstep in Crestwood Hills. "Emergency HO, a meeting," it screamed in a jagged, all-caps font. "Topic: the bee menace in our community." The flyer was a masterwork of fear-mongering propaganda. It spoke of aggressive swarms, unaccountable commercial operations, and the imminent danger to our children, citing anonymous neighbors who were living in fear. It was a call to arms for a public shaming, a modern-day witch trial with me and my bees cast as the villains. Karen's strategy was clear. If she couldn't win on the law, she would win by whipping up a mob. She was trying to isolate me, to turn my friends and neighbors against me with sensationalism and outright lies. She fundamentally misjudged the community, and she fundamentally misjudged me. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to prepare for battle. My counteroffensive was quiet, factual, and devastatingly effective. I enlisted Sarah and my new ally, Art. We became a three-person truth squad. First, I drafted a simple one-page fact sheet. At the top, in calm, bold letters, it read, "The facts about beekeeping in Crestwood Hills." It listed the key points of County Ordinance 7.14b, explaining in plain English the difference between livestock and apiaries. It included my county registration number and, most importantly, the case number and result of the code enforcement investigation. Complaint unfounded, property in full compliance. It was a direct refutation of every lie on Karen's flyer, backed by official documentation. Then I created a second document. This one was more delicate. It was titled, "Questions for the HOA Board at the Upcoming Meeting." It didn't make accusations. It simply posed questions based on the financial documents Sarah and I had analyzed. Question 1. Can the board provide the minutes from the meeting where the multi-year, no-bid landscaping contract with Green Thumb Landscapers, a company owned by a relative of the HOA president, was approved? Question 2. Can the board explain the line item for $1,200 for clubhouse decor from a home goods store and provide a list of the items purchased? Question 3. Can the board provide justification for the 30% increase in HOA dues over the last 2 years, while community amenities like the pool and playground have seen a decline in maintenance? We made 100 copies of each. For the next 2 evenings, Art, Sarah, and I walked the entire neighborhood. We didn't stuff mailboxes. We knocked on doors. We spoke to people face to face. To my surprise, the reception was not hostile. It was curious. People were tired of Karen's reign. "We saw her crazy flyer," one neighbor told me, shaking his head. "We figured there was more to the story." I would hand them the fact sheet about the bees. "This is the actual law," I'd say, "and this is the official report from the county." Then I'd hand them the second sheet. "And since we're all going to the meeting anyway," I'd add, "we thought these were some fair questions to ask the board about how our money's being spent." We weren't asking them to take my side. We were arming them with facts and empowering them to ask their own questions. We were transforming Karen's angry mob into an informed jury. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with tension. Karen and the other 4 board members, including a pale-looking Tim, sat at a long table at the front of the room, facing the crowd. Karen had a smug, predatory look on her face. She thought this was her moment of triumph, the public execution of her rival. She scanned the crowd, expecting to see angry, fearful faces. Instead, she saw people holding my fact sheets. The ambush was set, and the guest of honor had just walked right into it. Karen banged a gavel on the table, the sharp crack echoing through the silent room. "This emergency meeting of the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice resonating with manufactured gravity. "We are here tonight to discuss a serious threat to the safety and property values of our community. She launched into her pre-rehearsed speech, a tirade built on a foundation of innuendo and outright falsehoods. She painted a terrifying picture of my gentle honeybees, transforming them into a squadron of deadly predators, poised to descend on the neighborhood's children. One of our residents, she said, her voice dripping with false concern, has decided to put his own selfish hobby, a commercial enterprise, ahead of the well-being of his neighbors. He is operating an illegal livestock business in his backyard, in clear violation of the bylaws that we all agreed to live by. She held up a copy of her violation notice as if it were a sacred text. The crowd was quiet, but it wasn't the rapt silence she was expecting. It was the quiet of scrutiny. People were glancing down at the fact sheets in their laps, then back up at her. They were cross-referencing her lies in real time. She either didn't notice or didn't care. I have tried to reason with Mr. Riley, she lied, but he has refused to comply. He believes he is above the rules that govern the rest of us. She paused for dramatic effect, letting her accusation hang in the air. This defiance cannot be allowed to stand. I am asking for a community vote tonight to authorize the board to take all necessary legal action, including placing a lien on the property and forcing the removal of these dangerous animals. She finished with a flourish and looked out at the crowd, expecting a wave of applause and righteous anger. Instead, she was met with a sea of skeptical faces and a deafening silence. Before anyone else could speak, I stood up. I didn't walk to the front or ask for the microphone. I spoke from my place in the middle of the room, as one of them. My name is Jack Riley, I said, my voice calm but carrying easily through the room. And I think it's important that we're all working from the same set of facts. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face clouded over. This wasn't part of her script. Mrs. Albright, I said, using her formal name and looking directly at her, has made several serious allegations. Let's address them. First, she claims my bees are illegal livestock. This is factually incorrect. I held up my fact sheet. As many of you now know, County Ordinance 7.14b, the governing law in this matter, explicitly distinguishes between apiaries and livestock. My bees are not livestock under the law. Karen sputtered. The county doesn't tell our private association what to do. Actually, I countered, they do. The ordinance contains a preemption clause, which I've highlighted for everyone, making it superior to any HOA bylaw. But you don't have to take my word for it. I held up the code enforcement report. Mrs. Albright also neglected to mention that she filed a formal complaint against me with the county. The county sent an officer. They conducted a full inspection. This is his official report. The finding? Complaint unfounded. The property is in perfect textbook compliance. The officer also noted the complaint appeared to be frivolous and harassing. Gasps rippled through the room. People were looking at Karen with open hostility now. Her face was turning a blotchy red. But you know, I continued, my voice hardening slightly, I don't think this was ever really about bees. It was about control. And since this meeting is about the governance of our community, I think it's a perfect time to ask some other questions. I nodded to Sarah, who was sitting near a projector I had set up in the back. The screen behind Karen flickered to life. The first image was a copy of the landscaping contract with her brother-in-law's company. My first question is for the entire board, I said, my voice like a hammer. Can you explain why the HOA is locked into a no-bid contract with a company owned by the president's relative at rates nearly 40% above market value? The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting at the board. Tim looked like he was about to be physically ill. I clicked the remote. The next image was the HOA credit card statement with the lavish dinners and the home decor store charge highlighted. Can the board explain these planning meeting dinners at five-star restaurants? Can you explain the $1,200 charge for clubhouse refurbishment when nothing in here has been refurbished? The shouts grew louder. Karen was banging her gavel, but no one could hear it over the roar of a community that had finally found its voice. Her face, once smug and powerful, was now a mask of pure panic and rage. She was cornered, exposed, and utterly defeated, not by a swarm of bees, but by a storm of facts. The meeting descended into utter chaos. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, was completely drowned out by the angry shouts of her neighbors. The other board members, especially Tim, looked like they were facing a firing squad. They were being bombarded with questions they couldn't answer, questions about contracts they'd never read, and expenses they'd blindly approved. Art stood up, his booming mechanic's voice cutting through the din. "I make a motion," he yelled. "I move for an immediate independent forensic audit of the last 3 years of this association's finances. And I move for a vote of no confidence in Karen Albright as president." The room roared its approval. It wasn't a formal vote, not yet, but the will of the community was an undeniable tidal wave. Karen, realizing she had lost all control, grabbed her purse and practically fled from the clubhouse, pushing through the crowd as people jeered at her. The remaining board members, looking shell-shocked, quickly adjourned the meeting. As people began to file out, many of them stopped to shake my hand or clap me on the shoulder. "Thank you," one woman said, the mother of the boy with the wheelchair ramp. "No one's ever stood up to her like that." After the room had mostly cleared, the 3 remaining board members approached me, their faces a mixture of fear and desperation. It was Tim who spoke. "Mr. Riley, Jack, we had no idea. She just told us where to sign. We trusted her." "Trust isn't a defense against a breach of fiduciary duty, Tim," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "You're all on the hook for this, but you have a chance to make it right." They looked at me, desperate. "What do we do?" "You call an emergency board session tomorrow," I instructed. "You formally remove Karen as president. You vote to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit. And you put a freeze on all non-essential spending until that audit is complete. You do that, and you show the community you're serious about cleaning this up." They nodded eagerly, promising to do exactly as I said. The next day they did. Karen was officially removed and the audit was commissioned. But Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. 2 days later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. It was from a lawyer I'd never heard of, a snarling cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation, libel, and slander for the statements I'd made at the meeting. It threatened a multi-million-dollar slap suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. If I didn't issue a public retraction and apology, it was a classic bully tactic, a last-ditch effort to scare me into silence. I scanned the letter, laughed, and forwarded it to David. David's response was swift and brutal. He didn't just write a letter. He forged a legal cudgel. It was addressed to Karen's new low-rent attorney. "Dear Mr. Gable," it began, "we are in receipt of your letter on behalf of your client, Mrs. Karen Albright. To call its claims frivolous would be an insult to frivolous claims." David then proceeded to systematically shred every point. He explained the legal concept of truth as an absolute defense against defamation, noting that all of my statements at the meeting were fact-based and backed by documentary evidence. He then went on the attack. "While your client's civil claims are baseless," he wrote, "her own conduct exposes her to significant criminal and civil liability. We have documented evidence suggesting multiple violations of the state penal code, including potential embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Furthermore, as HOA president, your client had a fiduciary duty to the members, which she appears to have breached spectacularly. This exposes her to personal civil liability for the full amount of any misappropriated funds, plus punitive damages." The letter's closing paragraph was the final nail in the coffin. "Be advised that any attempt to file the threatened SLAPP suit will be met with an immediate motion to dismiss under the state's anti-SLAPP statute, which carries mandatory legal fee awards. It will also be met with a countersuit against your client for malicious prosecution. Finally, should your client proceed, we will have no choice but to forward our entire file, including the financial records, the code enforcement report, and witness statements, to the county district attorney's office with a formal request for a criminal investigation. Your client's legal jeopardy is significant. I suggest you advise her accordingly." He sent the letter via email and courier. Less than 24 hours later, David received a one-sentence email from Mr. Gable. "Please be advised that as of this morning, I no longer represent Ms. Karen Albright." The bully had been punched in the mouth, and her hired gun had run for the hills. We waited a week. When we heard nothing, I compiled everything. The financial analysis Sarah and I did, Art's witness statement, copies of the invoices, in David's legal summary and sent it all in a neat, organized package to the DA's Public Integrity Unit. Karen thought she could use the law as a weapon against me. She was about to find out what happens when the law is used as a shield for justice. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet, satisfying change. The district attorney's office confirmed they had received my packet and had opened a formal investigation into Karen Albright and the financial management of the Crestwood Hills HOA. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Faced with a criminal probe, Karen's last vestiges of support evaporated. Her remaining allies on the old board resigned in disgrace. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn almost overnight. It sold in less than a month. She was gone, not with a bang, but with the pathetic whimper of a U-Haul truck disappearing down the street in the dead of night. She left behind a community bruised but not broken, and a financial mess that the forensic audit was just beginning to untangle. An interim board was appointed, with Art reluctantly but dutifully stepping in as the new president. Their first official meeting was the polar opposite of Karen's star chamber. It was open, transparent, and respectful. The first item on the agenda was a formal motion to rescind, with prejudice, all fines and violation notices issued against me regarding my apiary. It passed unanimously to a round of applause. The second item was even more significant. Art proposed an amendment to the HOA bylaws themselves. The amendment was simple. In all matters where a specific county or state ordinance exists, said ordinance shall be considered the superior and governing rule, and all HOA bylaws shall be interpreted to be in alignment with it. It was a stake through the heart of the kind of tyranny Karen had practiced. It codified the very principle I had been fighting for. It also passed unanimously. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Crestwood Hills for years began to lift. It was a tangible change. People started talking to each other over their fences again. The infamous beige mailboxes started to be repainted in colors that reflected the owners' personalities. The Miller family's wheelchair ramp was repainted a bright, cheerful blue, and no one said a word. The Garcia family, hearing that the coast was clear, planted a new Japanese maple in their front yard, and several neighbors, including Art and me, brought over bags of mulch and helped them dig the hole. The community was healing. The playground, which had been rusting and neglected, became a weekend project. A dozen dads, myself included, showed up with sanders, paint, and new hardware. We repaired the swings, painted the slide, and laid down fresh wood chips. It wasn't an HOA mandated project. It was just neighbors helping neighbors. My bees, the catalyst for the entire conflict, became a strange sort of neighborhood mascot. People were no longer afraid of them, they were curious. I hosted a Meet the Bees afternoon in my backyard. I had an observation hive with glass sides so people could see the queen laying eggs and the workers building comb. I suited up a few of the more adventurous kids in small beekeeping veils and let them hold a frame of gentle, honey-filled comb. The fear Karen had tried to sow was replaced with fascination and respect. A couple of neighbors, inspired, asked me to mentor them in starting their own single hives the following spring. My 4 hives became a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience, a quiet testament to the fact that a healthy community, like a healthy colony, thrives on cooperation, not control. The final report from the forensic audit revealed that Karen had misappropriated or wasted over $40,000 in HOA funds over 3 years. The DA's office eventually filed charges, but since she had fled the state, the case remained open, a warrant waiting for her should she ever be foolish enough to return. The HOA's insurance, after a lengthy battle, covered most of the financial loss, and with the new responsible board in place, our dues actually went down for the first time in a decade. One sunny Saturday afternoon, months later, I was in the backyard just watching the bees. The air was warm, and the lavender was in full bloom, alive with the hum of thousands of tiny, diligent workers. Sarah came out with 2 glasses of iced tea, sweetened with a spoonful of the very honey that had started it all. She handed me a glass and put her arm around my waist. We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the dance of life in our garden. "You know," she said softly, "that honey tastes different this year." I smiled. "How so?" "It tastes like victory," she said, and she was right. It was sweet, golden, and pure. It was the taste of a battle fought and won, not with anger or aggression, but with patience, persistence, and the unshakable conviction that the law is a shield for the righteous, not a sword for the tyrant. I hadn't just saved my bees. I had, with the help of my neighbors, reclaimed our community. The quiet life I had sought after my military career had been interrupted by one last, unexpected conflict. But as I stood there, my wife by my side and the peaceful hum of my hives in the air, I knew that this, finally, was peace. A peace we had earned, a justice we had made.